Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Sunday, everybody. I hope you're having a restful weekend. We normally take Sunday off, but there is so much to cover from this week that we're doing a special episode today. So with that said, let's jump in, and we begin by moving through the salient developments in US-China relations from this week. US and PRC government delegations met in Geneva this week for discussions about artificial intelligence. The meetings were one of the outcomes of last November's Xi-Biden meeting. The talks were candid, according to the official readouts, and while no deliverables were expected, it's a good start to have these kinds of events in the first place. However, while the US side made clear that they were not there to negotiate the export controls on AI-related technology, the official PRC statement still said the Chinese side expressed, quote, its stern position on US restrictions and suppression of China in the AI field, end quote. Meanwhile, US software giant Microsoft continues to move AI researchers out of China to Canada and, it's reported now, Australia. Earlier this week, multiple Microsoft employees posted that the company's headquarters issued an email notifying several AI research teams in China that they would be relocated to the United States or Australia. This move could affect hundreds of employees. Chinese technology outlet Ji writes that those receiving the email must decide by June 7th, and they have the option to accept relocation or take a severance package. Microsoft USA also offers assistance with family visas. Meanwhile, this week also saw the continuation of military-to-military engagements, also another outcome of the Xi-Biden meeting last year. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Retna, had a video conference with Major General Li Bin, Director of the Central Military Commission Office for International Military Cooperation. The two sides discussed regional and global security issues, with the US side underscoring, quote, the importance of respect for high seas freedom of navigation guaranteed under international law. And he raised concerns over dangerous PRC actions against lawfully operating Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, end quote. Russia, North Korea and Taiwan were also discussed. Then on Thursday, UK-based Reuters reported that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is expected to meet with China's defense minister during a conference in Singapore later this month. Though the two have had recent phone conversations, the meeting will be the first substantial in-person engagement between the US and Chinese defense chiefs in 2 years. The same day, Thursday, the US Department of Homeland Security announced the addition of 26 textile companies based in the People's Republic of China to the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act entity list. Goods produced by the named 26 entities were restricted from entering the United States. In a statement, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, chaired by the Department of Homeland Security, expressed, quote, by focusing on cotton manufacturers based outside of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region that source cotton from that region, their designation will increase transparency and ensure responsible companies can conduct due diligence on their supply chains to ensure they do not include goods made with forced labor, end quote. Adding that these steps are, quote, part of the United States' commitment to eliminating the use of forced labor in the U.S. supply chain and promoting accountability for the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minority groups in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, end quote. US-based Wall Street Journal explains that the additions dramatically swell the size of Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act list, which, along with the change in methodology, brings the total number of banned companies to 65. All the companies named Thursday are part of China's textile industry. We also learned this week that the US House Committee advanced a bill to restrict Chinese biotech firms. State media hit back against the move, with state-run Global Times writing on Friday, quote, Chinese observers said the biotech legislation targeting Chinese companies, along with the US's new tariffs imposed on Chinese electric vehicles and advanced batteries, is part of the Biden administration's political show aimed at winning voters in an election year. US President Joe Biden and his administration will likely intensify crackdown on Chinese companies before the election, even at the risk of harming more US consumers and economic health. However, they said the US's hysterical crackdown on China will neither make China surrender nor impede China's development. Rather, it will harm US companies in international competition and hinder technological progress, end quote. Now, with all these talks of trade restrictions between the world's two largest economies, provokes the question, what is happening with supply chains? Well, US-based Bloomberg published a good piece this week discussing this very question. To end part one, let's examine some of the observations from the piece, which was titled, US Efforts to Reshape Global Supply Chains Gather Pace in Asia. New trade figures from this week show Taiwan's exports to the US are booming, and that they, quote, are just one example of the great power tensions and how they have reshaped supply chains and how China is getting left out of some of them, end quote. The island's sales to US markets climbed more than 80% in April from a year earlier, hitting a record high, according to the data released on Friday. In the first 4 months of 2024, shipments to the United States overtook those sent to China, which continued to shrink. Even when Hong Kong is included, China's share of Taiwan's trade is dropping, the outlet writes. Washington's various trade restrictions are part of a broader trade overhaul for key American allies in Asia, including major economies like South Korea and Japan. Quote, both are seeing a bigger share of exports heading into the US at the expense of China, end quote. Driving the change is a US campaign to cut China out of its supply chains, especially for sensitive and high-end technology products. Bloomberg explains that investment flows are shifting along with trade, with global firms investing in Southeast Asia to avoid US tariffs on China, and companies from Taiwan, Korea and Japan also building factories in the US to take advantage of subsidies for high-tech industry. An economist told the outlet, quote, this is a region-wide theme, reflecting the trade war and then the investment war. I think this is going to be accelerating. End quote. The latest numbers show that Taiwan's exports are starting to bypass China's altogether. New Taiwanese investment in China has also fallen dramatically to just $3 billion last year from a peak of $14.6 billion in 2010, even as firms based on the island invested record amounts elsewhere. Despite this trend, China is still seeing huge levels of manufacturing and exports, and Chinese companies are finding ways around the restrictions. Henry Gao, a law professor at Singapore Management University who researches Chinese trade policy, told Bloomberg, quote, the tariffs are effective in the sense that it managed to reduce direct imports from China, but ineffective in the sense that they still find their way to the US, end quote. But he adds that if the ultimate goal was, quote, near-shoring or friend-shoring, i.e. forcing the relocation of production facilities from China to countries more friendly with the US, then the strategy is working, end quote. Next up, the rise of China's new left. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, it's a huge help if you can hit the like button, and for those who have not done so already, subscribing is also a huge help, and you'll be on top of the most up-to-date analysis on China as it's released every day. Patreon and Buy Me Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. This week, David Ownby, an associate at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany, published a fascinating piece in the China Books Review called How China's New Left Embraced the State. The piece provides an interesting look at the political ideological milieu among Chinese intellectuals and elites generally. To end today's video, I wanted to examine some of this piece, which we're now quoting selected excerpts from directly. Last May, in a Beijing coffee shop, a well-known Chinese intellectual complained to me, there is no left wing in China anymore. Instead, we have people who call themselves leftists, but who, in fact, are extreme rightists and even flirt with fascism. This intellectual, whose name I do not reveal to protect him from possible reprisals, could be described as a Bernie Sanders-type socialist in an American frame of reference. He also condemned Chinese liberals, many of whom would be libertarians or conservatives in an American context, as social Darwinists and Trump supporters. But as a leftist, he was more concerned with what was happening at his end of the spectrum. The root of the problem, by his analysis, was China's success in surviving the 2008 financial crisis, which led many on the left to believe that Chinese socialism had moved from a primitive to an advanced stage, terms commonly used internally by the regime. These new leftists, who had previously been critical of inequality in China's society and economy, gradually became out-and-out statists, and their position was increasingly mainstream, as China itself pivoted left under Xi Jinping. Convinced that China had become the true incarnation of socialism, many of them felt that their task was to explain the superiority of the Chinese system to the world, and to those who doubted it, inside China. China's New Left traces its origins to the 1990s, as do other main intellectual groups in China, the liberals and the Neo-Confucians. During the 1990s, these new intellectuals evolved in an atmosphere of relative freedom and a sense of impending crisis. Without enjoying freedom of speech in the Western sense, they worked under fewer constraints than their counterparts under Mao had, and were not usually spokesmen for the regime. Ever since the reform era of the 1980s, the Chinese party state has attempted to shore up its legitimacy through a combination of material improvements and propaganda efforts. Yet many Chinese believe that what has transformed China over the past 4 decades are markets, entrepreneurship, and globalization. In other words, most Chinese people are patriotic and proud of what China has achieved, but I am not sure how many of them are truly convinced by socialism in a country where money talks so loudly. The same might be said about Xi Jinping and his thought. Leading New Left thinkers counter this by describing how Xi has built a socialist China based on the work of his predecessors. Jiang Shigong, professor of law at Peking University, describes Xi as leading a victorious struggle against American hegemony and the forces of capital within China, not only to return the nation to its socialist heritage, but to create a new version of socialism. In this rich and powerful China, Jiang argues there is no need for the workers to unite, because they no longer have any claims and will be cared for by an educated and committed elite. In other words, China now is socialism, and doesn't have to go back to the classic Marxist texts to attempt to cynicize the doctrine. Rather, since China has built the richest and most powerful socialist regime in the history of the world, the rest of the world will naturally learn from the Chinese experience. Jiang knows that China is not perfect, but compared to the fallen Soviet Union and flailing Western democracies, particularly the US, he sees China as such a shining success that her problems are mere details. Jiang and the New Left of today are, of course, surfing on the crest of China's rise, imagining that the wave will go on forever, something we all do when the times are good. But China's growth rates are falling, as are its birth rates, while young people worry about their future and women fulminate against the patriarchy. Zero COVID, and particularly its sudden end, took the wind out of China's sails. The truculence of US-China policy makes some Chinese people mad enough for Jiang's perspective to make sense to them, at least until they realize that inequality and class struggle remain domestic issues in a slowing economy. When that happens, China's New Left may have to decide whether its allegiance is to socialism or to the Chinese state, which has shut down Marxist groups on university campuses when they protest too strongly for workers' rights. Before I left Beijing last spring, I had a scrumptious dinner with several leftist intellectuals in one of the glorious banquet rooms attached to the old summer palace. They drank baijiu and talked about Mao's enduring wisdom, but there was more talk of taxes and how to avoid them, and fine red wines, how to buy them at a good price. Had there been cigars, I could have imagined myself in any swanky country club in the United States. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great weekend, have a good Sunday, and I will see you all tomorrow.